Greetings, sir. My name is Yap Sheng. I will be presenting on the topic of sovereignty and non-intervention in modern treaty relations. The signing of the Reciprocal Trade Agreement between Malaysia and the United States of America has generated significant political and legal debate. While the government maintains that the agreement is a sovereign exercise of foreign policy, critics argue that certain provisions may restrict Malaysia's ability to act independently, particularly where compliance with another state's policies is required. The legal question is whether state sovereignty can be eroded by international agreements or remains protected through consent and safeguards. In modern international law, sovereignty does not mean that a state is free from all international obligations. Instead, sovereignty refers to a state's legal authority to govern itself and its capacity to enter into treaties voluntarily and as an equal member of the international community. This principle is affirmed by Article 2 Sub 1 of the United Nations Charter, which recognizes the sovereign equality of states. States regularly accept limitations on their regulatory discretion through treaties, especially in trade and economic agreements. Such limitations are not, by themselves, a loss of sovereignty. When treaty obligations arise from negotiation, mutual benefit, and informed consent, they represent an exercise of sovereignty rather than its erosion. However, sovereignty is protected by the principle of non-intervention. Article 2 Sub 7 of the UN Charter and the 1970 Friendly Relations Declaration prohibits states from interfering directly or indirectly in the internal or external affairs of other states, including through coercive economic or political measures. The International Court of Justice in Nicaragua and United States clarified that intervention becomes unlawful when coercion is used to influence a state's political or economic decision-making. Therefore, the legal concern is not the existence of treaty obligations, but whether those obligations were accepted freely. Problems arise when treaty clauses indirectly dictate policy alignment or when economic pressure leaves a state with no genuine policy choice. In conclusion, international agreements do not erode sovereignty simply because they impose obligations. Sovereignty is compromised only where obligations result from coercion or unlawful intervention, rather than voluntary and equal consent under international law. That's all from me. Thank you.
So next, part 2 of our advice addresses a most common misunderstanding that the treaty law weakens the sovereignty. So in reality, treaty law is one of the most important where sovereignty is exercised. A state is not controlled simply because it signs a treaty. A state is controlled only when it signs a treaty that are poorly negotiated, vaguely drafted, and strategically unmanaged. Properly used, treaty law allows states to cooperate while still retaining authority over their choices. This is clear from the Vienna Convention of Law of Treaties, which forms the foundation of the treaty system. The convention is built on the state consent. No state is bound unless it has agreed to be bound. That reflects sovereignty in its clearest form. But the conventions does not stop at consent. It also governs how treaties are interpreted. Articles 31 to 33 requires treaties to be interpreted according to their ordinary meaning, in context and in light of their object and purpose. These are not political guidelines. They are legal constraints. They prevent powerful states from unilateral reshaping obligations to suit their own interests. Interpretation is therefore anchored in law and not in power. In this way, treaty law does not remove sovereignty. It disciplines and protects it. Building on that foundation, treaties themselves contain mechanisms that actively preserve state control. One of the most important is the inclusion of securities and public interest clauses. These clauses recognize that no economic or trade commitment can override a state core responsibility. They allow governments to limit obligations when national security, public order, or essential public interests are at stake. In doing so, they protect the state's right to regulate and to govern in the interest of its populations. Treaties also commonly include exist clauses. This confirms that consent is not permanent or unconditional. The lawful possibility of withdrawal prevents irreversible loss of controls and strengthens a state's negotiating positions. Sovereignty is preserved not only by refusing commitments, but by restructuring them. In addition, review and renegotiation provisions recognize that treaties operate over time. They allow states to revisit obligations in the light of changing economic, political, and social realities. This ensures that sovereignty is not frozen at the moment of signature, but continues to operate as circumstances evolve. Together, these two transform treaties from instruments of restrictions into instruments of managed corporations. However, the effectiveness of all these protections ultimately depends on draftings. In modern international law, power is exercised not only through military or economic strengths, but through legal language. Ambiguity almost always benefits stronger states. Vague terms create space for pressure. reinterpretation and expansions of obligations through dispute settlements. Precisions, by contrast, sets legal boundaries. It limits external interference, preserves domestic policy spaces, and reduces the ability of powerful parties to dominate outcomes. Drafting is therefore not technical, it is strategic. It is one of the primary ways in which sovereignty is exercised today. So, treaty law should not be understood as a form of subservience. Properly used, it is a sophisticated mechanism of control. Through consent, interpretation rules, protective clauses, and precise drafting, international law allows states not merely to cooperate, but to control the terms on which that cooperation takes place. Thank you, that's all from my part.
Good day, sir. My name is SHAHIZATUL Azra, and I'll be continuing the presentation providing a legal and political perspective of my findings on whether the RTA affects state sovereignty and the pathways available to address any perceived unfairness. Traditionally, sovereignty was viewed as an absolute authority over a state's sovereignty, but the modern international law recognizes sovereignty as exercised through consent. So by entering into treaties, a state does not lose sovereignty, but rather it expresses their authority through the voluntary commitment to the agreed obligations. Under the principle of pacta sunt fernanda, states must comply with treaties that they have agreed to. Then, following the Responsibility of States for Internationally Wrongful Acts 2001, every internationally wrongful act entails responsibility. A state also cannot justify non-compliance to the obligations on the basis of internal political dissatisfaction or economic disadvantages. Instead, treaties are void only if the consent were obtained through force or by doctrine of necessity in exceptional circumstances. This means that unilateral withdrawal or non-compliance with the obligation may put or expose Malaysia to legal liability. However, this obligation exists alongside, not above, a state sovereignty. That said, international agreements can create pressure, especially in context of a great power rivalry. When one or more dominant powers exert economic pressure, smaller states may perceive a risk of excessive external control, but perception alone does not amount to legal erosions of a state's sovereignty. This is where Malaysia's political hedging and equidistance becomes relevant. Illustrations can be taken from the Malaysian strategic move amid the US-China trade war, where they diversified their partnerships to avoid overdependence over any single power. Examples include participations in China Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 and the recent involvement with the BRICS, the intergovernmental bloc of the South. Malaysia at the same time also engaged with the US by supporting the framework such as the TPP and the IPEF, and much recently Malaysia elevated their partnership with the US by signing the RTA that reduces and eliminates tariff on a wide range of USA and Malaysian goods. This multi-alignment approach allows Malaysia to keep options open, preserve autonomy, and maximize benefits in uncertain global environment. In conclusion, international agreements may constrain state action, but they do not automatically erode sovereignty. Sovereignty today is managed through law, consent, and strategy, and not isolation. As such, international law enables states to uphold obligations while responding to excessive influence through lawful and peaceful means. That's all from me.
Thank you, Azra. Good day, Mr. Justin. My name is Tisha Gunasegaran, and I'll be discussing on the part of domestic constitutional framework and treaty making. The key issue here is whether the international agreements like the RTA can erode our sovereignty. The short answer is not if our constitutional system is functioning properly. Malaysia follows a dualist system, which means that international treaties do not automatically become part of our domestic law. Even after the executive signs a treaty, it has no legal effect internally unless the parliament passes legislation to incorporate it. This is extremely important for sovereignty because it ensures that international obligation cannot override domestic laws or public policy without democratic approval. In practical terms, this means that the RTA cannot change labor laws, environmental standard, or consumer protections unless the parliament explicitly agrees. The executive, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has the power to negotiate treaties and represent Malaysia internally. However, this power is not absolute. It is constitutionally limited by Parliament and courts to ensure decisions are made in the public interest. Parliament plays a critical role by scrutinizing, debating, and approving the treaties. This creates a democratic oversight and ensures that the agreements like the RTA do not sacrifice local industries, employment for foreign commercial interest. On the second part, I'll be discussing on the implementation, international decision, and protecting sovereignty. Even after a treaty is approved, the domestic institutions still control how the international decisions are applied. The judiciary safeguards sovereignty by interpreting the treaty obligation through the constitution. Courts decide whether the international decision can be enforced or locally. A well-known example is the case of Medellin and Texas, where the US Supreme Court ruled the ICJ judgment are not enforceable without the domestic legislation. In addition, Malaysia has legal mechanism to protect itself. Through reservation and limitation clauses, the government can tailor the treaty obligation to fit domestic priorities, especially in sensitive sectors like healthcare. So the termination clauses also exist in order to allow the state to withdraw if a treaty begins to seriously harm the national interest. Together, these safeguards ensure that Malaysia remains compliant with the international law without surrendering control over domestic policy. And on the final part of mine is what are the takeaways for the minister? So the real conclusion is this. Treaties are tools for cooperation, not instrument of surrender. Domestic institutions ensure that the RTA supports the economic growth while protect the citizens. If any provisions are unfair, harmful, or imbalanced, the renegotiation is legally and politically possible without breaching the international law. Ultimately, Malaysia's constitutional framework ensures that we honor our international obligation on our own terms, or in other words, sovereignty is not eroded by the treaties, it is preserved precisely because our constitution controls how those treaties operate. That is all from me. I'll pass the floor to the next person. Thank you.
I'm Yashni Chandran. Today I'm going to talk about actionable policy options. To ensure Malaysia's independence within RTA should propose a strategy of defensive legalism. The action should take is embedded as self-charging security exceptions. Under GATT Article 21, this ensures Malaysia, not the US, defines its own national security. Therefore, will issue an unilateral interpretive declaration ratification. This legally clarifies that trade cooperation does not imply military alignment, protecting the non-aligned status from the start. The second priority is avoiding legal entrapment. This too is a 5-year sunset clause. This forces a mandatory review by Parliament, ensuring the treaty is a choice, not a cage. The safeguard, which means will incorporate a flexible termination clause under Article 56 of the VCLT. Hence, relying on fundamental change of circumstances is too risky due to the high bar set in the Gabasikovo-Negimoros case. Instead, a simple 12-month notice period ensures the concern is always conditional and recoverable. Finally, diversification and risk management, which urge to manage reputational and market risks. Propose multilateral hedging by deepening ties with Asian and the WTO. We dilute the influence of any single superpower. Therefore, will establish a joint implementation committee to conduct sovereignty audits every 3 years. This prevents creeping jurisdiction and ensures we are not accidentally triggered into cross default with other international obligations. Other than that, by adopting these measures, Malaysia transitioned from a passive participant to a cooperative sovereign. We remain open for business and economically integrated, but legally autonomous and diplomatically free. These policy options provide the Prime Minister with the necessary tools to navigate superpower pressures while securing Malaysia's independent future. Thank you. In conclusion, Malaysia shows that sovereignty today is not absolute but flexible. By skillfully applying international law, it proves that legal commitments do not need political witness. Using tools like drafting protections, interpretative statement, and exit mechanism, Malaysia lets law stabilize its position rather than limit it. Through economic cooperation and legal autonomy, Malaysia successfully protects its national interests while remaining a credible, responsible, and active member of the international system. This is the essence of a cooperative sovereignty.